Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to GovComms, the podcast that examines the practice of content communication in government and the public sector. My name's David Pembroke, and thank you very much for joining me. Today, we're joined by Professor Mark Evans, who is Director of Democracy 2025, and he is the former Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, or IGPA as it's known, at the University of Canberra. Mark has an outstanding and distinguished career in developing high-quality, values-driven knowledge institutions that really look to policy impact and professional development programs. And he's done an enormous amount of work, and I won't list it all now, but an enormous amount of work, not only here in Australia, but with governments around the world. And interestingly, he worked with Content Group last year on a research project. And we're going to today talk a little bit about that research project, but also to talk about Democracy 2025 to understand what his next great challenge is and how he is going to help to build greater trust in democratic institutions, not only to 2025, but hopefully a long way beyond that as well. He joins me in the studio this morning. Professor Mark Evans, thanks very much for joining us on GovComms.
I'm delighted to be here.
Mark, the research project that we started last year, people who listen to the project would know that we've developed an approach which is really all about government being better storytellers, being better able to explain policies, programs, services, regulations, so as that people can understand the reasons for why those decisions have been made. We then worked, that was work that was done with the Australian National University to put that in place. But interestingly, we then worked with you, and I remember presenting a prototype of our approach, and you very quickly looked at this and said, this is not just for communications people. This should really go to the heart of how policymakers go about thinking about audiences and thinking about communities before they even start to think about the way that they're going to develop policy. Why is it that you saw it that way? Or what was the insight that you were working off when you saw that this need for better storytelling and better communication was in fact a policy challenge every bit as much as it was a communication challenge?
Well, two key reasons, really. First of all, as we all know, communication is the oxygen of every organisation, whether it's public or private. And the most effective organisations in the world are those that are able to communicate their ideas and messages clearly to their target audiences. And let's face it, public organisations haven't really been very good at that, particularly over the last decade, particularly since the end of the Howard period. You know, you could argue that successive prime ministers have failed to get their big ticket items up. Despite the fact that Malcolm Turnbull was a very popular prime minister in many ways, maybe his major vulnerability was his inability to connect up effectively with everyday Australians. You know, he was kind of the darling of the chattering classes, but he didn't really connect up with everyday Australians. So first of all, there's a fundamental problem there with public organisations being able to win the war of ideas, you know, and actually acknowledge that increasingly they are involved in a complex war of ideas. So that was the first one. The second reason, though, is that if you think about any sort of reform programme or process that's been introduced in Australian government and actually in other Westminster democracies over the last 3 decades, there's always this tendency to create a little unit over here, you know, an innovation unit or a reform unit or a strategic communications unit. And a failure to mainstream those ideas into the DNA of the organisation. And for me, that's what's happened with strategic communication. There's been this tendency to say that strategic communication is purely the role of the information unit over here, or this particular person in an organisation, when, as you rightly say, we're all content developers in public organisations, and we really need to mainstream this thinking in everything that we do. And in particular, there was a major problem when you look at policy development. I mean, again, going back to that original observation about prime ministers being able to get up their big ticket items, well, that goes to the very heart of how they design policy. They haven't designed policy with a key understanding of the key messages and frames needed to win the war of ideas, even when there's been an obvious win. I mean, if you look at the failure to get up the mining tax, for example, you know, we all know that Australia, with Saudi Arabia, is the only country in the world that pays the private sector to extract our resources out of the ground for no payment, right? But it was the whole policy frame there was won by the mining industry, which was around this will destroy communities, we will lose jobs, etc., etc. But actually, when you quantified the number of jobs vis-a-vis the benefits that could have been accrued through a mining tax. I mean, let's face it, they have it in Alaska, and every kid gets a free university education, gets free master's education if they achieve to that level. The idea that we didn't take advantage of that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in Australia, for me, was fundamentally a failure of politics and strategic communication.
So why is it that there is that disconnect and there isn't that mainstreaming that you talk about around the importance of communication? Why doesn't it sit at the heart of everything that policymakers do when they're developing policy for government?
Well, they've not really been trained to think that way. So it is interesting, and this is a problem in the UK as well. If you look at the United States and you look at the big schools of government, and particularly the postgraduate qualifications that you would do at any of, the Kennedy School at Harvard or whatever, communications would be a core subject. Right? It's not here in Australia, right? In Westminster-style democracies in general, there's been this tendency to bypass communications. It's like an add-on that you do. It's not part of the core curriculum. So I think that's a key dimension to it. I mean, there has been kind of an inverted snobbery as well, right? I mean, I remember, in one of my former jobs, I worked for a while with Tony Blair, Blair was well known through Alistair Campbell.
Yes.
That's when the phrase spin came to the fore. But actually, I mean, I worked closely in that government, and for me, that wasn't spin. What they were trying to do was to win the war of ideas, right? They knew that ideas were important, and they also knew that it was absolutely fundamental to capture the public imagination through the 24/7 media cycle. And Campbell knew how to do that. But of course, it was diagnosed as spin. It was kind of viewed as kind of the murky, mucky world of government. Rather than America, it was viewed as a core discipline in public affairs. So I think there's a different sort of kind of cultural tradition in Westminster-style democracies when compared with other democracies. But we're now waking up to that fact.
Well, that's indeed... You designed a graduate certificate course in content communication and public policy. What was that design, and what were the elements of that course that you were putting together, and what are you hoping to achieve with that outline of the course that you have developed?
Well, obviously that was very much a partnership between us and Content Group.
Yeah.
So, you really enlightened me to the broader discipline of content development, right? So I think I have to say that at the beginning. I came into this really as somebody who has acted as a senior policy advisor and, of course, has been an academic studying policy development. So straight away, I saw the importance of content communication in terms of framing policy design from ideas right the way through to delivery of policy through projects and programs into the community. That before a minister makes any announcements, the clarity of the message in terms of the impacts, positive and potentially negative, on society have been very clearly calculated and determined. And the idea that you need to have obviously a whole range of different, I call them policy instruments for delivering your message. You obviously have to have a very clear sense of strategic focus and strategic design to how you design a content community strategy to underpin a major intervention. And obviously, increasingly, as we know, there's no one audience. So that's another really important sort of insight that we all know about the complexity of modern government. There's no one audience.
Yeah.
Our role, really, as policy designers, is to understand how an intervention will affect different audiences in different ways, and to develop mitigating strategies to deal with sometimes the potential fallout where you actually have to convince a group that, yes, you're going to take a loss with this particular intervention, sometimes creating a softener, right? Or sometimes appealing to their sense of fairness or fair go, to actually say, well, look, this is more than just me. This is about improving the quality of our society more generally. So there's a discipline to that, isn't there, David?
Absolutely, and I think there's the complexity and this is the increasing challenge, I think, for government to communicate, is that they now communicate in a world that is far more contested than it's ever been before, and the challenge to get people's attention and to earn the right to a share of that time and attention so as that they will stop long enough to listen to an argument. When there is just so much choice as to where people put their time and attention. I think you mentioned, Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair. It was very different back then. That was before, the mobile phone has taken over. That was before there was just this proliferation of channels and social and other things. How much more difficult do you see that it is now for policymakers and for communicators in government, now that it is such a complex world in which they communicate?
Look, I think you're right to say that we are in a different era. Although what I would say about the Blair period is, British politics is even more complex because of the Europeanisation dimension. So when we're talking about media, we're talking about the European media. So in a sense, they had to be more sophisticated earlier on, perhaps.
Certainly, yes. It's a larger beast.
It's a larger beast.
It's a much larger beast.
But
now,
certainly the world is definitely more complex now in terms of, particularly the impact of social media. And obviously it creates a number of big puzzles for government, doesn't it? How does it cope with the noise? How does it make sense of the noise? Now, this is something that we focus on a lot in relation to the work that we're doing on trust, because obviously traditionally Westminster-style bureaucracies were underpinned by the principle of being seen but not heard, right? So in other words, having departments of state speaking up in defence of a policy or intervening to deal with fake news is not viewed to be in line with the conventions of the Westminster model, right? Well, that's clearly absurd now. That can't go on, because if the Australian Public Service, right, doesn't stand up for its own policies, then who's going to? There's nobody else is going to leap to their defence. Maybe some of the more sort of enlightened upmarket newspapers might do from time to time. But look, the point is that we are in a different era now, and I've made this point to the Third-Day Review in our submission by IPA, and that is that the APS needs to win hearts and minds. It needs to engage with fake news. It needs to engage in better storytelling about the great work that it does. Because if it doesn't do that, then it's going to be a pawn in a very complex game of chess. But I think it needs to do that using kind of keep it simple type principles. And that is all about evaluating risk in an effective way, but at the same time being aware of the dangers of risk aversion. Because another key thing that's happened because of the declining trust in government and politicians is that, traditionally people would say the public service is risk averse.
Yes.
Right? Now the dominant view is, well, actually it's politicians that are risk averse. Politicians are risk averse because they cannot cope with the complexity of the noise, as we call it, and the 24/7 media system, right? And because of that, they don't grapple some of the big fundamental public policy problems that we're confronting and what Australian citizens want them to confront. In fact, increasingly, they're sort of absolving their responsibility to other forms. I mean, obviously the postal vote on same-sex marriage. I mean, one theory was that it was a great strategic victory for Turnbull. Another view, and this comes up a lot in the focus groups that we do, is that this was parliamentarians absolving themselves from a responsibility to engage in courageous leadership. So look, I suppose what I'm saying there is that unfortunately, decision making has become even more problematic because of this kind of vicious cycle of distrust, uncertainty, and risk aversion. So, for me, the light here is, well, how can we use strategic communication to actually break through?
Yeah.
To break through that vicious circle.
Well, I tend to I completely agree with you. I think, if you're not going to tell your story, someone will tell it on your behalf.
Yeah.
Or someone will have a view, or many, many people will have a view. And unless you are turning up consistently, regularly, in simple terms, explaining to people, well, these are the decisions that we've taken, and the reasons for that, that you're never going to get the message across. You're never going to explain. So that then comes to the issue of then capability inside government to be able to explain. What's your views on that capability? Does it exist? Do the skills and capability and awareness, do they exist such that governments can prosecute exactly what you're talking about by being able to create useful, relevant, consistent content to engage and connect with audiences in order that they can understand?
Okay, there's a number of ways in which we can approach that question. One would be to say, well, the problem is that the existing orthodoxy, right, is a command and control orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about here is basically a new way of a new form of engagement, which involves a broader range of people in the organisation. It involves empowering people to convey the message, right? And so, look, the problem that we have with the Australian Public Service, and again, this has come up, this will definitely come up in the third A review, is the problem of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right? And how actually this new form of engagement requires opening up the system of government. It doesn't mean that you don't make calculations on the basis of sound risk assessment. That continues, but basically this is about power with responsibility, empowerment with responsibility, and that's a new way of working. Right? So it's going to require a culture shift. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, in terms of capability, well, actually, my view is that we don't really use the brain of our public service effectively anyway, right? Because of hierarchy. Over the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of my time training graduates in the APS. I see them 5 or 6 years later. Some of them have been lucky and are doing jobs that they're interested in, motivate them. A lot of them are really just in it still for the lifestyle. They don't think that their expertise is being used effectively. They're engaged in running processes of government with very little concrete outcome, right? So they don't find it particularly thrilling work, right? So I actually think that within the public service, there is a cadre of people who get social media, who get the new. I mean, they are a younger generation. The fact of the matter is that people our age aren't going to be running this stuff really in the future. Well, that's not to say that we can't learn new skills in term and improve our capabilities. But the other problem I think probably with strategic communication is that it's in the public service is that it may have been dominated by grey-haired, middle-aged men like me in the past, and that's not necessarily about talking to the right audience, isn't it? So we need a greater diversity in terms of the workforce in order to understand the different channels of communication that will have an impact. I think that there is the capability there, but it needs to be upskilled.
And given permission.
Exactly. Given permission and empowered. But as you also know, every sector's now after strategic communication professionals.
Yeah.
So, it's a very competitive environment for those skills. I think we definitely need to build strong partnerships, such as the ones that we have, to actually support the public service in this endeavour. I'm hoping that a key outcome of the APS review will be a renewed focus on strategic communication. And having that holistic approach rather than the segmented, siloed approach going forward. And from what I hear, that there are some strong messages emerging around that.
Good. Now, listen, just to move to just a final question around Democracy 2025 and the work that you're doing at the Museum of Australian Democracy. What are you trying to achieve with Democracy 2025?
We're trying to avoid a doomsday for Australian democracy. And that is that, as you know, we've been doing, this is our 4th national survey that we launched in Parliament House last week, and we do ongoing focus groups all over Australia on how Australians imagine and understand their democracy. And if current trends continue, no more than 10% of Australians will trust their politicians and political institutions. That places Australia.
What?
Yeah, that's how bad it is. And there's been a very steep decade of decline from 2007, where 86% of Australians trusted their politicians and political institutions, to 40% today. The level of trust in politicians rivals that of the social media. It's now down at 20%. Today, it's down at 20%. Trust in politicians and government ministers, right? In fact, actually, in the survey, there's only actually 5 institutions that has a rating above 50%. Now, having said that, we know that this is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right? But even on a global scale, Australia is not doing well, especially when you consider that the countries that are at our level at the moment are those that were impacted really badly by the global financial crisis. You're talking about the southern Mediterranean states. You're talking about Spain and Italy. We're just above Greece still at the moment. But their economies were devastated.
Yeah.
Now, we've had 25 years of economic growth. So there's a serious issue emerging here, largely because trust impacts on the ability of government to actually deal with these big, thorny issues. Because if they don't think that they've got the people with them, right, they won't take the risk to actually focus on the problem. So, during that period, we can see that we've seen more risk aversion in government, more risk aversion with politicians. The most alarming thing that's emerged from our most recent survey, however, is that social trust has also reached an all-time low. So that's the trust that Australian citizens have in their neighbours and in their communities. It's now down to 47%, right? And the Hilda survey, which is the big sort of social inclusion survey, reported about a month ago. And what that told us was that the gap between rich and poor is getting larger. But most seriously, the gap between the poor and the poorest of the poor has increased very significantly. And what we're seeing really is the emergence of three kind of new groups of Australian in terms of attitudes. One group, roughly about 30% of the Australian electorate, are now major critics of the two-party system, right?
Yeah.
And they're looking for new politics, and they're voting independent across the ideological, scale from Hanson to Phelps.
Yeah.
Right. Then there's a group of about 10% of Australians who are completely switched off traditional politics. If we didn't have compulsory voting, they wouldn't be voting at all. Right. They have absolute disdain for politicians and for contemporary politics. Now, they tend to be on low incomes. They tend to have the same attitudes that voted for Brexit and Trump, right? They're feeling left behind and marginalised and profoundly economically insecure. And then you've got this other curious group, which is a tactical group. And they're not into the two-party system, right? But they're starting to vote tactically in their constituencies because their view is that if they vote tactically, they're more likely to get more resources into their communities. So anyway, so what we're seeing is the way in which we've shifted decisively now from what we used to call an allegiant democracy, a deferential democracy, which was based upon strong social and political cohesion, to what I call a divergent democracy, where increasing numbers of Australians are looking for a new politics. And, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next election. I mean, obviously, Labour are in a position of maximum opportunity at the moment, right? But they're not really responding to the democratic deficit. The Republic. It is interesting that they've announced a referendum on the Republic already. There's a bit of courage in that, I think, in the run-up to an election. I'm hoping that the parties will start to take this democratic deficit much more seriously. Certainly the Australian Public Service are, and they're a key partner in this enterprise.
All right. Well, that's a depressing note to end our conversation. Strategic communications might be able to fix a few things, but I don't know it's going to be able to fix.
No, there's an optimistic note here, right? So the optimistic note in terms of research is that Australians want to see change, and there is a big appetite for change.
Yeah.
So, if you go to our website, democracy2025.gov.au, you'll see that there's a third of the report is on the reforms that Australians would like to see. And also, what we can also see is that Australians remain passionate about democracy and politics. They just don't like this politics. Right. So for me, and that's another focus of the work of Democracy 2025, our focus is on, how can we be the best democracy that we can be? Why should we be happy, coming in at number 62, right?
Yeah.
We should be up there with the best. Yeah. We have the resources, we have the innovation, socially, economically, we have the passion for our future. That dwarfs a lot of other countries. So Democracy 2025 is basically about saying, where's the glitter? Where do we need to strengthen Australian democracy? What does international best practice tell us? And how can we be the best democracy that we can be?
Well, that's a happy note to finish on, and that is a great mission. So, Mark Evans, thank you very much for coming in, and we'll get you back another day to continue the conversation about trust deficits and how, in fact, we can build that capability so government can better explain themselves to people, because I think people can take it if they understand it. But if they don't understand it, that's when things start to go awry. But to you, the audience, thank you very much for coming back once again. To Mark Evans, my guest today, thank you for coming in. And I will be back at the same time in 2 weeks' time, now that we're on a 2 weeks rotation, not a 1 week rotation. And so I'll be back then, and I look forward to your company. But for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.